On Truth and Lie in an Extra-Moral Sense by Friedrich Nietzsche. Read by Mariah Saldivar. In some remote corner of the universe, poured out and glittering in innumerable solar systems, there once was a star on which clever animals invented knowledge. Period. That was the highest and most mendacious minute of world history, yet only a minute. Period. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star grew cold, and the clever animals had to die. Period. One might invent such a fable and still not have illustrated sufficiently how wretched, how shadowy and flighty, how aimless and arbitrary the human intellect appears in nature. Period. There have been eternities when it did not exist, and when it is done for again, nothing will have happened. Period. For this intellect has no further mission that would lead beyond human life. Period. It is human, rather, and only its owner and producer gives it such importance, as if the world pivoted around it. Period. But if we could communicate with the mosquito, then we would learn that he floats through the air with the same self-importance, feeling within itself the flying center of the world. Period. There is nothing in nature so despicable or insignificant that it cannot immediately be blown up like a bag by a slight breath of this power of knowledge. And just as ever Porter wants an admirer, the proudest human being, the philosopher, thinks that he sees on the eyes of the universe telescopically focused from all sides on his actions and thoughts. Period. It is strange that this should be the effect of the intellect, for after all it was given only as an aid to the most unfortunate, most delicate, most evanescent beings, in order to hold them for a minute in existence, from which otherwise, without this gift, they would have every reason to flee as quickly as Lessing's sun. Period. In a famous letter to Joachim Eschenburg, Lessing relates the death of his infant son, who understood the world so well that he left it at the first opportunity. Period. The haughtiness which goes with knowledge and feeling, which shrouds the eyes and senses of man in a blinding fog, therefore deceives him about the value of existence by carrying in itself the most flattering evaluation of knowledge itself. Period. Its most universal effect is deception, but even its most particular effects have something of the same character. Period. The intellect, as a means for the preservation of the individual, unfolds its chief powers in simulation, for this is the means by which the weaker, less robust individuals preserve themselves, since they are denied the chance of waging the struggle for existence with horns or the fangs of beasts of prey. Period. In man, this art of simulation reaches its peak. Here, deception, flattering, lying and cheating, talking behind the back, posing, living in borrowed splendor, being masked, the disguise of convention, acting a role before others and before oneself. In short, the constant fluttering around the single flame of vanity is so much the rule and the law that almost nothing is more incomprehensible than how an honest and pure urge for truth could make its appearance among men. Period. They are deeply immersed in illusions and dream images. Their eye glides over the surface of things and sees forms. Their feeling nowhere led into truth, but connects itself with the reception of stimuli, playing, as it were, a game of blind man's bluff on the backs of things. Period. Moreover, a man permits himself to be lied to at night his life long when he dreams, and his moral sense never even tries to prevent this, although men have been said to have overcome snoring by sheer will power. Period. What indeed does man know of himself? Can he even once perceive himself completely, laid out as an illuminated glass case? Does not nature keep the most from him, even about his body, to spellbind and confine him in a proud, deceptive consciousness, far from the coils of the intestines, the quick current of the bloodstream, and the involved tremors of the fibers? She threw away the key, and woe to the calamitous curiosity which might peer just once through a crack in the chamber of consciousness, and look down, and sense that man rests upon the merciless, the greedy, the insatiable, the murderous, in the indifference of his ignorance, hanging in dreams, as it were, upon the back of a tiger. Period. In view of this, whence in all the world comes the urge for truth? In so far as the individual wants to preserve himself against other individuals in a natural state of affairs, he employs the intellect mostly for stimulation alone, period. But because man, out of need and boredom, wants to exist socially, herd fashion, he requires a peace pact, and he endeavors to banish, at least, the very crudest bellum omni contra omnes, war of all against all, from his world, period. This peace pact brings with it something that looks like the first step toward the attainment of his enigmatic urge for truth, period. For now that is fixed with henceforth shall be truth, that is, a regularly valid and obligatory designation of things is invented, and this linguistic legislation also furnishes the first laws of truth, for it is here that the contrast between truth and lie first originates, period. The liar uses the valid designations, the words, to make the unreal appear as real. He says, for example, I am rich, when the word poor would be the correct designation of his situation, period. He abuses the fixed conventions by arbitrary changes or even by reversals of the names, period. When he does this in a self-serving way, damaging to others, then society will no longer trust him, but exclude him, period. Thereby men do not flee from being deceived as much as from being damaged by deception. What they hate at this stage is basically not the deception, but the bad, hostile consequences of certain kinds of deceptions, period. In a similarly limited way, man wants the truth. He desires the agreeable life-preserving consequences of truth, but he is indifferent to pure knowledge, which has no consequences. He is even hostile to possibly damaging and destructive truths, period. And moreover, what about these conventions of language? Are they really the products of knowledge, of the sense of truth? Do the designations and the things coincide? Is language an adequate expression of all realities? Only through forgetfulness can man ever achieve the illusion of possessing a truth in the sense just designated, period. If he does not wish to be satisfied with truth in the form of tautology, that is, with empty shells, then he will forever buy illusions for truths, period. What is a word? The meaning of a nerve stimulus in sounds, period. But to infer from the nerve stimulus a cause outside us, that is already the result of a false and unjustified application of the principle of reason, period. If truth alone had been the deciding factor in the genesis of language, and if the standpoint of certainty had been divisive for designations, then how could we still dare to say, the stone is hard, as if hard were something otherwise familiar to us, and not merely a total subjective stimulation? We separate things according to gender, designating the tree as masculine and the plant as feminine, period. What arbitrary assignments, period. How far this oversteps the canons of certainty, period. We speak of a snake. This designation touches only upon its ability to twist itself and could therefore also fit a worm, period. What arbitrary differentiations, period. What one-sided preferences, first for this, then for that property of a thing, period. The different languages, set side by side, show that the matters with words is never the truth, never an adequate expression, else there would not be so many languages, period. The thing in itself, for that is what pure truth without consequences would be, is quite incomprehensible to the creators of language and not at all worth aiming for, period. One designates only the relations of things to man, and to express them one calls out the boldest metaphors, period. A nerve stimulus, first transposed into an image, first metaphor, period. The image in turn, imitated by sound, second metaphor, period. And each time there is a complete overleaping of one spear right into the middle of an entirely new and different one, period. One can imagine a man who is totally deaf and has never had a sensation of sound and music, period. Perhaps such a person will gaze with astonishment at Cialdini's sound figures. Perhaps he will discover their causes in the vibrations of the string, and one will swear that he must know what men mean by sound, period. It is this way with all of us concerning language. We believe that we know something about the things themselves when we speak of trees, colors, snow, and flowers, and yet we possess nothing but metaphors for these things, metaphors which correspond in no way to the original entities, period. In the same way that the sound appears as a sand figure, so the mysterious X of the thing in itself first appears as a nerve stimulus, then as an image, and finally as a sound, period. Thus the genesis of language does not proceed logically in any case, and all the material within and with which the man of truth, the scientist, and the philosopher later work and build, if not derived from Neverland, it is at least not derived from the essence of things, period. Let us still give special consideration to the formation of concepts, period. Every word immediately becomes a concept inasmuch as it is not intended to serve as a reminder of the unique and wholly individualized original experience to which it owes its birth, but must at the same time fit innumerable more or less similar cases, which means, strictly speaking, never equal, in other words, a lot of unequal cases, period. Every concept originates through our equating what is unequal, period. No leaf ever wholly equals another, and the concept leaf is formed through an arbitrary abstraction from these individual differences, through forgetting the distinctions, and now it gives rise to the idea that in nature there must be something besides the leaves, which would be leaf, some kind of original form, after which all leaves have been woven, marked, copied, colored, curled, and painted, but by unskilled hands, so that no copy turned out to be a correct, reliable, and faithful image of the original form. We call a person honest, period. Why did he act so honestly today, we ask, period. Our answer usually sounds like this. Because of his honesty, period. Honesty, that is to say again, the leaf is the cause of the leaves, period. After all, we know nothing of an essence-like quality named honesty. We know only numerous individualized and thus unequal actions, which we equate by omitting the unequal, and by then calling them honest actions, period. In the end, we distill from them a qualitas occulta, hidden quality, with the name of honesty, period. We obtain the concept as we do the form, by overlooking what is individual and actual, whereas nature is acquainted with no forms and no concepts, and likewise with no species, but only with an X, which remains inaccessible and undefinable for us, period. For even our contrast between individual and species is something anthropomorphic and does not originate in the essence of things, although we should not presume to claim that this contrast does not correspond to the essence of things. That would of course be a dogmatic assertion, and as such would be just as indemonstrable as its opposite, period. What then is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms, in short, a sum of human relations, which have been enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, and which after long use seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. Truths are illusions about which one has forgotten that this is what they are, metaphors which are worn out and without sensuous power, coins which have lost their pictures and now matter only as metal, no longer as coins, period. We still do not know where the urge for truth comes from, for as yet we have heard only of the obligation imposed by society that it should exist. To be truthful means using the customary metaphors. In moral terms, the obligation to lie according to a fixed convention, to lie heard like in a style obligatory for all, period. Now man of course forgets that this is the way things stand for him, period. Thus he lies in the manner indicated, unconsciously and in accordance with habits which are centuries old, and precisely by means of this unconscious and forgetfulness he arrives at his sense of truth, period. From the sense that one is obliged to designate one thing as red and another as cold, and a third as mute, there arises a moral impulse in regards to truth, period. The venerability, reliability, and utility of truth is something which a person demonstrates from himself, from the contrast with the liar, whom no one trusts and everyone excludes, period. As a rational being, he now places his behavior under the control of abstractions, period. He will no longer tolerate being carried away by sudden impressions, by intuitions, period. First, he universalizes all these impressions into less colorful, cooler concepts, so that he can entrust the guidance of his life and conduct to them, period. Everything which distinguishes man from the animals depends upon his ability to volatilize perceptual metaphors in a schema, and thus to dissolve an image into a concept, period. For something is possible in the realm of these schemata, which can never be achieved with the vivid first impressions, the construction of a pyramidal order according to castes and degrees, the creation of the new world of laws, privileges, subordinations, and clearly marked boundaries, a new world, one which now confronts than other vivid world of first impressions as more solid, more universal, better known, and more human than the immediately perceived world, and thus as the regulative and imperative world, period. Whereas each perceptual metaphor is individual and without equals, and is therefore able to elude all classification, the great edifice of concepts displays the rigid regularity of a Roman columbarium and exhales in logic that strength and coolness which is characteristic of mathematics, period. Anyone who has felt this cool breath of logic will hardly believe that even the concept, which is as bony, foursquare, and transposable as a die, is nevertheless merely the residue of a metaphor, and that the illusion which is involved in the artistic transference of a nerve stimulus into images is, if not the mother, then the grandmother of every single concept, period. But in this conceptual crap game, truth means using every die in the designated manner, counting its spots accurately, fashioning the right categories, and never violating the order of caste and class rank, period. Just as the Romans and Etruscans cut up the heavens with rigid mathematical lines and confined a god within each of the spaces thereby delimited, as within a templum, so every people has a similarly mathematically divided conceptual heaven above themselves, and henceforth thinks that the truth demands that each conceptual god be sought only with his own spear, period. Here one may certainly admire man as a mighty genius of construction, who succeeds in piling an infinitely complicated dome of concepts upon an unstable foundation, and, as it were, on running water, period. Of course, in order to be supported by such a foundation, his construction must be like one constructed of spiders' webs, delicate enough to be carried along by the waves, strong enough not to be blown apart by every wind, period. As a genius of construction, man raises himself far above the bee in the following way. Whereas the bee builds with wax that he gathers from nature, man builds with the far more delicate conceptual material which he first has to manufacture from himself, period. In this he is greatly to be admired, but not on account of his drive for truth or for pure knowledge of things, period. When someone hides something behind a bush and looks for it again in the same place and finds it there as well, there is not much to praise in such seeking and finding, period. Yet this is how matters stand regarding seeking and finding truth within the realm of reason, period. If I make up the definition of a mammal, and then after inspecting a camel, declared, "Look, a mammal," I have indeed brought a truth to light in this way, but it is a truth of limited value, period. That is to say, it is a thoroughly anthropomorphic truth, which contains not a single point which could be true in itself, or really and universally valid apart from man, period. At bottom, what the investigator of such truth is seeking is only the metamorphosis of the world into man, period. He strives to understand the world as something analogous to man, and at best he achieves by his struggles the feeling of assimilation, period. Similar to the way in which astrologers considered the stars to be man's service, and connected with his happiness and sorrow, such an investigator considers the entire universe in connection with man. the entire universe as the infinitely fractured echo of one original sound man, the entire universe as the infinitely multiplied copy of one original picture man. Period. His method is to treat man as the measure of all things, but in doing so, he again proceeds from the error of believing that he has these things, which he intends to measure, immediately before him as mere objects. Period. He forgets that the original perceptual metaphors are metaphors and takes them to be the things themselves. Period. Only by forgetting this primitive world of metaphor can one live with any repose, security, and consistency. Only by means of the petrification and coagulation of a mass of images which originally streamed from the primal faculty of human imagination like a fiery liquid, only in the invincible faith that this sun, this window, this table is a truth in itself. In short, only by forgetting that he himself is an artistically creating subject does man live with any repose, security, and consistency. Period. If but for an instant he could escape from the prison walls of his faith, his self-consciousness would be immediately destroyed. Period. It is even a difficult thing for him to admit to himself that the insect or the bird perceives an entirely different world from the one that man does, and that the question of which of these perceptions of the world is the more correct and is quite meaningless, for this world have to have been decided previously in accordance with the criterion of the correct perception, which means in accordance with the criterion which is not available. Period. But in any case, it seems to me that the correct perception, which would mean the adequate expression of an object in the subject, is a contradictory impossibility. Period. For between two absolutely different spheres, as between subject and object, there is no causality, no correctness, and no expression. There is at most an aesthetic relation, I mean a suggestive transference, a stammering translation into a completely foreign tongue, for which there is required, in any case, a freely inventive intermediate sphere and meditating force. Period. Appearance is a word that contains many temptations, which is why I avoid it as much as possible. Period. For it is not true that the essence of things appears in the empirical world. Period. A painter without hands, who wished to express in song the pictures before his mind, would, by means of this substitution of spheres, still reveal more about the essence of things than does the empirical world. Period. Even the relationship of a nerve stimulus to the general image is not a necessary one. Period. But when the same image has been generated millions of times and has been handed down for many generations and finally appears on the same occasion every time for all mankind, then it acquires at last the same meaning for men it would have if it were the sole necessary image, and if the relationship of the original nerve stimulus to the generated image were a strictly causal one. Period. In the same manner, an eternally repeated dream would certainly be felt and judged to be reality. Period. But the hardening and congealing of a metaphor guarantees absolutely nothing concerning its necessity and exclusive justification. Period. Every person who is familiar with such considerations has no doubt felt a deep mistrust of all idealism of this sort, just as often as he has quite early convinced himself of the eternal consistency, omnipresence, and fallibility of the laws of nature. Period. He has concluded that so far as we can penetrate here, from the telescopic heights to the microscopic depths, everything is secure, complete, infinite, regular, and without any gaps. Period. Science will be able to dig successfully in this shaft forever, and the things that are discovered will harmonize with and not contradict each other. Period. How little does this resemble a product of the imagination, for if it were such, there should be some place where the illusion and reality can be divined. Period. Against this, the following must be said. If each of us had a different kind of sense perception, if we could only perceive things now as a bird, now as a worm, now as a plant, or if one of us saw a stimulus as red, another as blue, while a third even heard the same stimulus as a sound, then no one would speak of such a regularity of nature. Rather, nature would be grasped only as a creation which is subjective in the highest degree. Period. After all, what is a law of nature as such for us? We are not acquainted with it in itself, but only with its effects, which means in its relations to other laws of nature, which in turn are known to us only as sums of relations. Period. Therefore, all these relations always refer again to others and are thoroughly incomprehensible to us in their essence. Period. All that we actually know about these laws of nature is that we ourselves bring to them time and space, and therefore relationships of succession and number. Period. But everything marvelous about the laws of nature, everything that quite astonishes us therein and seems to demand explanation, everything that might lead us to distressed idealism, all this is completely and solely contained within the mathematical strictness and inviolability of our representations of time and space. Period. But we produce these representations in and from ourselves with the same necessity with which the spider spins. Period. If we are forced to comprehend all things only under these forms, then it ceases to be amazing that in all things we actually comprehend nothing but these forms. Period. For they must all bear within themselves the laws of number, and it is precisely number which is the most astonishing in things. Period. All that conformity to law, which impresses us so much in the movement of the stars and in chemical processes, coincides at bottom with those properties which he brings to things. Period. Thus it is we who impress ourselves in this way. Period. In conjunction with this, it is, of course, follows that the artistic process of metaphor formation with which every sensation begins in us already presupposes these forms and thus occurs within them. Period. The only way in which the possibility of subsequently constructing a new conceptual edifice from metaphors themselves can be explained is by the firm persistence of these original forms. Period. That is to say, this conceptual edifice is an imitation of temporal, spatial, and numerical relationships in the domain of metaphor. Period. Chapter 2. We have seen how it is originally language which works on the construction of concepts, a labor taken over in later ages by science. Period. Just as the bee simultaneously constructs cells and fills them with honey, so science works unceasingly on this great columbarium of concepts, the graveyard of perceptions. Period. It is always building new, higher stories and shoring up, cleaning and renovating the old cells, above all, and it takes pains to fill up this monstrously towering framework, and to arrange therein the entire empirical world, which is to say, the anthropomorphic world. Period. Whereas the man of actions binds his life to reason and its concepts so that he will not be swept away and lost, the scientific investigator builds his hut right next to the tower of science, so that he will be able to work on it and to find shelter for himself beneath those bulwarks which presently exist. Period. And he requires shelter, for there are frightful powers which continuously break in upon him, powers which oppose scientific truth with completely different kinds of truths, which bear on their shields the most varied sorts of emblems. Period. The drive toward the formation of metaphors is the fundamental human drive, which one cannot for a single instant dispense with in thought, for one would thereby dispense with man himself. Period. This drive is not truly vanquished and scarcely subdued by the fact that a regular and rigid new world is constructed as its prison from its own infernal products, the concepts. Period. It seeks a new realm and another channel for its activity, and it finds this in myth and in art generally. Period. This drive continually confuses the conceptual categories and cells by bringing forward new transferences, metaphors, and metonymies. Period. It continually manifests an ardent desire to refashion the world which presents itself to waking man, so that it will be as colorful, irregular, lacking in results and coherence, charming, and eternally new as the world of dreams. Period. Indeed, it is only by means of the rigid, regular web of concepts that the waking man clearly sees that he is awake, and it is precisely because of this that he sometimes thinks that he must be dreaming when this web of concepts is torn by art. period. Pascal is right in maintaining that if the same dream came to us every night, we would be just as occupied with it as we are with the things that we see every day, period. If a workman were to dream for 12 straight hours every night that he was king, said Pascal, I believe that he would be just as happy as the king who dreamt for 12 hours every night that he was a workman, period. In fact, because of the way that the myth takes it for granted that miracles are always happening, the waking life of a mythically inspired people, the ancient Greeks, for instance, more closely resembles a dream than it does the waking world of a scientifically disenchanted thinker, period. When every tree can suddenly speak as a nymph, when a god in the shape of a bull can drag away maidens, when even the goddess Athena herself is suddenly seen in the company of Pisistratus driving through the marketplace of Athens with a beautiful team of horses, and this is what the honest Athenian believed, then as in a dream anything is possible at each moment, and all of nature swarms around man as if it were nothing but a masquerade of the gods who were merely amusing themselves by deceiving men in all those shapes, period. But man has an invincible inclination to allow himself to be deceived, and is, as it were, enchanted with happiness when the rhapsodist tells him epic fables as if they were true, or when the actor in the theater acts more royally than any king, period. So long as it is able to deceive without injuring, that master of deception, the intellect, is free. It is released from its former slavery and celebrates its Saturnalia, period. It is never more luxuriant, richer, prouder, more clever, and more daring, period. With creative pleasure, it throws metaphors into confusion and displaces the boundary stones of abstractions, so that, for example, it designates the stream as the moving path which carries men where he could otherwise walk, period. The intellect has now thrown the token of bondage from itself, period. At other times it endeavors, with gloomy officiousness, to show the way and to demonstrate the tools to a poor individual who covets existence. It is like a servant who goes in search of booty and prey for his master, period. But now it has become the master, and it dares to wipe from its face. But now it has become the master, and it dares to wipe from its face the impression. But now it has become the master, and it dares to wipe from its face the expression of indigence, period. In comparison to its previous conduct, everything that it now does bears the mark of dissimulation, just as that previous conduct did of distortion, period. The free intellect copies human life, but it considers this life to be something good, and seems to be quite satisfied with it, period. The immense framework and planking of concepts to which the needy man clings his whole life long in order to preserve himself is nothing but a scaffolding and toy for the most audacious feats of the liberated intellect, period. And when it smashes this framework to pieces, throws it into confusion, and puts it back together in an ironic fashion, pairing the most alien things and separating the closest, it is demonstrating that it has no need of these makeshifts of indigence, and that it will now be guided by institutions rather than by concepts, period. There is no regular path which leads from these institutions into the land of ghostly schemata, the land of abstractions, period. There exists no word for these institutions. When man sees them, he grows numb, or else he speaks only in forbidden metaphors and in unheard-of combinations of concepts, period. He does this so that by shattering and mocking the old conceptual barriers, he may at least correspond creatively to the impression of the powerful present intuition. There are ages in which the rational man and the intuitive man stand side by side, the one in fear of intuition, the other with scorn for abstraction, period. The latter is just as irrational as the former is artistic, period. They both desire to rule over life, the former by knowing how to meet his principal needs by means of foresight, prudence, and regularity, the latter by disregarding these needs and as an overjoyed hero counting as real only that life which has been disguised as illusion and beauty, period. Whenever, as was perhaps the case in ancient Greece, the intuitive man handles his weapons more authoritatively and victoriously than his opponent, then, under unfavorable circumstances, a culture can take shape and art's mastery over life can be established, period. All the manifestations of such a life will be accompanied by his dissimulation, this disavowal of indigence, this glitter of metaphorical intuitions, and in general this immediacy of deception. Neither the house, nor the gate, nor the clothes, nor the clay jugs gives evidence of having been invented because of a pressing need, period. It seems as if they were all intended to express an exalted happiness, an Olympian cloudlessness, and as it were, a playing with seriousness, period. The man who is guided by concepts and abstractions only succeeds by such means in warding off misfortune without ever gaining any happiness for himself from these abstractions, period. And while he aims for the greatest possible freedom from pain, the intuitive man, standing in the midst of a culture, already reaps from his intuition a harvest of continually inflowing illumination, cheer, and redemption, in addition to obtaining a defense against misfortune, period. To be sure, he suffers more intensely when he suffers. He even suffers more frequently, since he does not understand how to learn from experience and keeps falling over and over again into the same ditch, period. He is then just as irrational in sorrow as he is in happiness. He cries aloud and will not be consoled, period. How differently the stoical man who learns from experience and governs himself by concepts is affected by the same misfortunes, period. This man, who at other times seeks nothing but sincerity, truth, freedom from deception, and protection against ensnaring surprise attacks, now executes a masterpiece of deception. He executes this masterpiece of deception in misfortune, as the other type of man executes his in times of happiness, period. He wears no quivering and changeable human face, but as it were, a mask with dignified, symmetrical features, period. He does not cry, he does not even alter his voice, period. When a real storm cloud thunders above him, he wraps himself in his cloak, and with slow steps he walks from beneath it, period. The end.